There was something kind of hypnotic about watching the England cricketers playing football in the rain, almost trying to vibes the bad weather away at Manchester. Earlier, Johnny Bairstow had continued to warm up doing his wicket-keeping drills while it was raining the entire time until the ground staff suggested that they might just need to put the covers on to protect the square. And Brendan McCullum stood near those same covers with a bat for a fielding practice for a very, very long time, despite the fact that it was raining almost the entire time he was out there. But even McCullum couldn't alpha the clouds around Old Trafford away. Eventually, he just put his bat under his jumper like a naughty kid and left the field. The truth is that when Manchester wants to rain, it does. And often that is during important Ashes tests. In 2005, England needed one more wicket, and Australia were trying to add to their last wicket partnership when rain had the final say. In 2013, Australia were well on top and hoping to make their own 2-0 comeback when the rain ended that match. And then we have this match, which for the first time in this entire series was actually one-sided. And yet the only way England could try and get their win was keeping their players out on the ground playing football to suggest that the conditions weren't as bad as the umpires might have thought. But eventually, they just got drenched and they had to leave. Essentially, England were trying to Bazball the rain away. Broad basically said as much in his latest column. And in this match, we actually saw Bazball break Australia. But we have found out that it was sadly impotent versus the Manchester weather. Of course, the biggest issue for England really is that they went 2-0 down. There have been 54 teams who have gone down 2-0 in a 5-test series after the opening matches. Would you like to know how many of those ever came back to win 3-2? 1. And that was a fluke that I will explain later. So essentially, in the 53 normal situations where cricket has been played in 5-test series, the team who went down 2-0 lost. Weirdly, there have been 5 occasions where the side has come back to level the series at 2-2, but all of them went on to lose. The first one was in 1894-95, which was a remarkable series. England won that match, but Australia made 586 to start the game. They then enforced the follow-on, and they needed 177 to win, and they lost by 10 runs. The second match was, well, just as weird. England were rolled for 75 when they batted first. Australia did a little bit better, and then England exploded for 475, and Australia ended up around 100 runs short. So after 2 matches in that series, Australia was down 2-0. But they certainly had 2 chances to win. And they did in the 3rd and 4th matches by a combined total of an innings and 529 runs to go on to level the series. Then in the last match, they set England a huge chase, especially for those days, of 297, and a Yorkshire batter named Jack Brown passed 50 for the second and final time of his test career to make 140 and win the game for England. That series just remains one of the most remarkable that was ever played. And you look at all those tests, and Australia could have won at 5-0, and they ended up losing the series. South Africa came back against England in 1955. England won the first match easy, but the next 2 were quite close. England were up 2-0, and then South Africa just got up in the 3rd. South Africa scored a huge amount in their second innings to tie the series, before missing out their chance of winning the series in a very low-scoring, messy test at the end. It's fair to say that both teams were fairly evenly matched. India went down 2-0 against the West Indies in 74-75. Their batting was quite weak, but their spinners started to take a few more wickets and clawed their way back into the series. But the West Indian batters made 600 runs in the final test to just basically blow India out of the water. I'd say that the West Indies team certainly looked a lot better than the Indian one on paper. India again went down 2-0 in Australia in 77-78, but this was a much better Indian team and a horrendous Aussie lineup because of World Series cricket. India really should have stolen one of the first 2 matches. Instead, they managed to lose by 16 runs and then by 2 wickets. But India came back pretty hard in the next 2, winning by an innings in one and by 222 runs in the other. Then in the final test, they let Graham Yelp and Bob Simpson make a bunch of runs against them. And India had to fight back all the way through the game. And in the last innings, they were set 493 to win. And not a single player made 100, but everyone made runs. Sadly though, they had a late collapse and they ended up being dismissed for 445. Like Australia in 1884-85, India were probably the better team. But losing both close games up front really did cost them. Weirdly enough, there are no teams that came back from 2-0 down to 2-2 only to draw the final game. But the main point here is that even being the better performing team doesn't help you much once you're down 2-0. You just put yourself at the mercy of a toss, wet wicket, overhead conditions, drop catch, or rain. When in doubt, I say always try not to go 2-0 down in a 5-test series. I know that you think you could run your favourite cricket team better than those who do, but no one is going to let you do that. So why not try Wicket Cricket Manager to satisfy that urge? Pick your nation, pick your league, pick your players, and yell at them when they do poorly. You can find it in the links below or by searching for Wicket Cricket Manager in your app store today. But how did England go down 2-0? They were both very close tests, especially considering the Australian team hasn't really fired yet, and we're now 4 tests into the series. They've been at best patchy. But at Edgbaston, England declared on day 1 when they had chance of adding, let's say, another 20 to 40 runs. While that is the big one that everyone remembers, their second innings there was also a bit odd. They lost early wickets, and then their big names didn't quite fire, and so for them, they actually batted quite slow and they limped a little bit, meaning that Australia didn't have to chase as many as they probably should have. They also made a comical amount of errors all the way through that game. Wickets from no balls, Harry Brook forgetting where the ball had gone almost completely, and gifting extras. And even at the end, they still had a chance to win the match. In fact, they were ahead all the way through. Because you could make a similar list for Australia. All England had to do was close out one of the weakest tails in a generation from Australian cricket. England had their own issues as well because they couldn't use their spinner because one was hurt, and instead of picking another spinner who was match ready, they went for Moeen Ali. Cummins actually prefers spinners in tests, but he's not very good at scoring from them, as his one-day record would show. And he needed to make runs in this situation. So instead, England had to use root, and they tried bounces until essentially Australia won, which was the only time the Aussies were actually in front in that game. England never got in front of Lords. They got the ball to move around early on, but David Warner made a 50, and Usman Khawaja faced a load of balls to kind of negate the best conditions that England had. Australia would end up with a decent first innings on the back of Steve Smith. Yet England were fighting back pretty well when they lost a bunch of wickets from over-attacking towards the end of the second day. That continued the following morning, and even as they kept themselves in the match by bowling nothing but short stuff for hours, their chase was still quite tough. It wasn't made any easier by Bairstow's mistake, and really Stokes made it look, and certainly feel, closer than it was. And what about at Old Trafford? I would say that England has been smarter with their use of Bazball as this series has gone on. But they didn't use it here to score as fast as they could have, or to clear early enough to give themselves as much time as possible to take the 10 wickets, especially once they got 150 runs in front. They could have just declared then and given themselves a chance later on to slap a lot of balls around if they needed to chase something. It was riskier, but with the weather around, it might have been their best option. So what we've ended with in this series is this weird situation where England declared too early because of Bazball, and then didn't Bazball when they really needed to Bazball, and they declared too late here. But think about it this way, England had the best of day 5 at Lords, and since then they've been by far the better team almost every single day. I'm listing all their mistakes here, but I could easily do the exact same thing with Australia, right? But let's just go through it test by test. If you have Australia as marginally better at Edgbaston, which I think is fairly debatable, but let's just go there because they won the game, then you would say that Australia was slightly more in charge of the Lords test. But then they were certainly slightly behind for most of Headingley, and England were massively on top here. So England have been the better team overall, if you want to look at it that way. And that is all well and lovely, and I don't disagree with that at all. But that is not how Test cricket actually works, right? There are no moral ashes, or even vibes ashes. There is just the ashes where England are 2-1 down, and they cannot win this series. But remember, I did say that one team had won a series when being 2-0 down. That was Australia in 1936-37. England had the better of the first game, despite everyone thinking they were going to get destroyed. Ernie McCormack, the Australian quick, had lots of back issues and couldn't bowl as much as he wanted, which meant that England put on a big score, and they set Australia 381 to win. And unfortunately for Australia, the wicket got wet before they went out to bat, and they managed only 58 runs. Ouch. The second test, England made a decent first innings. Then they declared when the wicket got wet, which meant that Australia had to go in and bat again, which meant Australia got blown away again. The Aussies did okay in the follow-on, but the match was completely over by that point. Now, there are two things that I want to tell you about this series. One is that these were timeless tests, meaning that the rain was far less likely to draw any match. So essentially, England still needed to win one of the 3 remaining games to win that series. And Australia won the third test on the 6th day, which was actually the 7th day because they had a rest in there. But they also had a shot in the arm as they had picked their legendary left-arm wrist spinner Chuck Fleetwood Smith. The larger-than-life character would go on to take 10 wickets in the 4th test and win the game for Australia. Him and Tiger Bill O'Reilly, the world's best bowler at this point, teamed up for 12 wickets in the 5th match to help Australia win that one as well. How about this? Australia won the last 3 tests by a combined total of an innings and 713 runs. It would be hard to say that the Australian team were not just better than England, but massively better than England, and they just got done by the conditions in the start. But I have overlooked one thing here. Don Bradman played in this series. He made 83 in the final innings of the 2nd test, but by that stage, that match was already long gone. So essentially, in the first 2 games when the heat was on, he made 38 runs from 3 innings, a 38 and 2 ducks. And then he went nuts. But let's just put it this way. In the first 2 losses, he made 121 runs. In the next 3 wins, he made 689 runs in 5 innings. It was the 8th most runs ever scored in a series, despite basically forfeiting his first few goes. But how about this? I've marked on here a Brian Lara series where he scored 688 against Sri Lanka in a 3-test series. That is the record for a series of 3 tests or fewer. And Bradman beat that by a run. So the only way to come back from 2-0 down in a test series in the entire history of our sport is to have timeless tests that mean you're just far less likely to ever have a draw, or have the greatest batter of all time playing 3 straight innings that completely change the entire complexion of the series. Oh, and it's worth also mentioning here that Manchester has had 32 entire days of test cricket washed out. That is the most of any ground in our sport, and they tower over the second worst, which is the SCG. So basically, to come back, you need Bradman and timeless tests. And England had Bazball, but also the Manchester weather. But England will not lose their chance of winning the series because of the rain. They're in this situation because they made errors in 2 close contests that hurt them. These things happen in Test cricket. They probably had the better of the conditions over the first 2 matches. They planned really well for the Aussie batters. They limited the impact of Hazelwood and Boland. Had some luck with the Lion injury as well. But they dropped catches and declared weirdly. But ultimately, they allowed Australia to be in those games and then to win them. So over the 4 tests, England have played the better cricket. And while people are focusing on the attacking, England have looked smarter. And as the series has progressed, and they didn't lessen their errors, and they seem to have learnt more. And that's not even mentioning that picking Mark Wood was like snorting adrenochrome. But the truth is, whether it is luck or bad play, once you are 2-0 down, everything has to go right for you. The toss, the conditions, the bounce of the ball, and also the weather. England had Bazball, not Bradman. But instead of a timeless test, they had Manchester rain.